All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm very glad that you could join us today. My name is Elizabeth Cronk-Warner. I have the privilege of being the Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and as we do anytime we gather, I do want to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And today we're a little early for Veterans Day, but we want to celebrate and acknowledge Veterans Day. So to start off, before we get into our panel, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone here on our panel and both possibly in the room and then on Zoom, so virtually with us, who has served in the military. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge your service. Thank you so much. We really appreciate all that you have done. And we're excited to be together today to have this important conversation about that service. So today's topic is, should the U.S. institute mandatory national service? Now, mandatory national service, which is also called compulsory service, is a requirement that people serve in the military or complete other works of public service for 1 to 2 years. The U.S. military draft created during the Civil War is one type of mandatory national service. The U.S. has had an all-volunteer military since 1973, when President Nixon ended the draft following the extremely controversial Vietnam War, which provoked huge public protests against both the war and the draft. Public opinion is roughly split among Americans about mandatory national service. Young adults, who would be the ones to be required to complete such service, are about 39% in favor and 57% against. The panelists, all from the S.J. Quinney College of Law, have all served their countries in the military during periods of national conflict and have diverse views about mandatory national service. Audience members will also certainly be polled about their views and encouraged to ask questions. So we're going to chat for about 35 to 40 minutes. We have several questions for each of our panelists. And then when we are done with the questions, we'll open it up to those in the audience. You'll see Slido. So anybody can ask questions if you go to slido.com. The information is on the slide up here. And enter hashtag universal service. We have a tablet that will allow me to see your questions and then ask those of our panelists here today. So you don't have to wait until we're done with our questions, pre-prepared questions. You can go ahead and ask questions at any particular time when it comes to you. So with that housekeeping matter, I do want to introduce our very esteemed panelists today. So first, farthest from me, on my left, your right, is Amos Giora. Amos is a professor of law here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. He is a distinguished fellow at the Consortium for Research and Study of Holocaust and the Law at Chicago-Kent College of Law, and a distinguished fellow and counselor at the International Center for Conflict Resolution, Katz School of Business, University of Pittsburgh. Professor Giora is a retired lieutenant colonel in the Israeli Defense Forces, where he served in the Judge Advocate General Corps. Closest to me on my right is Professor James Holbrook. Professor Holbrook is a clinical professor of law emeritus who taught negotiation, mediation, and arbitration at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. In 1969, he served in combat in Vietnam with the 9th Infantry Division, for which service he received the Army Commendation Medal for Valor and a Bronze Star. He is an advisor to the University Veterans Support Center and is the manager of special projects in the law school's Career Development Office. Sitting next to Professor Giora is Leah Bench. Leah is a first-year law student here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. She served in the United States Air Force as a munitions specialist for 4 years, during which time she received numerous awards and an early promotion. In 2015, she deployed to Guam in the Pacific Theater to support B-52 aircraft. And in 2020, she received a Master of Legal Studies degree from the College of Law and is now pursuing her legal career in military law and public policy for veteran support. And last but certainly not least, next to Professor Holbrook is Mike Mazaros, who is a 2L at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. He graduated from West Point, where he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in military history with a focus on the U.S. Army's modernization and the transition to an all-volunteer force following the Vietnam War. He was an infantry officer in the Army for 9 years, during which he served as the brigade battle captain in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. So please join me in welcoming our amazing panel. So my first question goes to Professor Giora. Professor Giora, what does the mandatory draft mean?
Good afternoon, all of those here and on Zoom. So I wear the Israeli hat in this conversation, and those of you who don't know, in Israel, we have mandatory draft for men and women alike. The length of service depends on the particular time for a variety of reasons, but historically for men it's been 3 years and for women 2 years. Women today serve in combat roles like men. The question of should you serve, should you not serve, for most Israelis, without even thinking about it, the answer is yes, because it's just part of our culture. There are, however, some exceptions. One is our Orthodox men don't serve. Orthodox women serve in something called national service, which is working in hospitals, working with Holocaust survivors, working with those who are vulnerable members of the community. The other community that does not serve are Israeli Arabs. 20% of Israel is comprised of Israeli Arabs. They don't serve for a variety of political reasons, but for those of us who do serve, or our children who serve, it's just simply part of life. It is, and to call it an expectation, I think, is the easy part. It's part of the DNA, and the process begins when, in our case, our 3 children, when they were juniors in high school, the identification of what unit you would go to is just a normal part of life. And if I may speak personally, we have friends whose children didn't serve in the military but did the national service. We also have some friends whose children didn't do this or didn't do that. And for me, because my 3 children served, I find that really problematic not to do this or that, because again, our DNA as a society is this whole notion of the collective. Don't forget that Israel is a socialist country by origin. And the notion, again, of the collective is just an obvious that you serve in the military.
Thank you. So our next question is for Leah. Leah, if a compulsory service requirement was implemented in the United States, should both men and women be required to serve? Or like our current selected service legislation, should only men?
So I think to stay consistent with how society values equality between men and women, I think it's almost expected at this point for both men and women to serve. Otherwise, I feel like we'd be facilitating a double standard at that point.
Okay, so our next question is for Mike. Mike, how would mandatory service impact socioeconomic inequality in the United States?
So I think typically in this conversation, we look at the military as a form of social mobility. As we saw with Vietnam, the Vietnam War specifically, that's not necessarily how the U.S. military is set up anymore. We kind of have to disavow ourselves of the assumption that military service is inherently good, inherently safe, even in a peacetime war or a peacetime army or military. During the height of the GWOT, more than 3/4 of the casualties that occurred during that time from 2006 to 2018 were not combat related. So if you look at that and you look at all the other issues that come along that veterans are facing at the time, or currently, after discharge, you're seeing veterans that are 5 times more likely to have PTSD symptoms, 56% more likely to deal with substance abuse or depression, and then you're twice as likely to have suicidal ideations as a veteran than the general population. And then you're also, I think it's 50% more likely to be homeless as a veteran. It's not necessarily something that is a form of social mobility upwards anymore. It tends to actually increase your risk factors of having a less prosperous life.
So building on that then, Professor Holbrook, what % of the U.S. population currently serves in the military?
This is not well known. Less than 1% of the American population serves in the U.S. military. So the footprint for military service is so tiny, and it falls disproportionately on a small group of people and their families. And unless you've served, you don't anticipate all the consequences which Mike outlined, which can be horrific after service is complete. And because it falls on such a small footprint, the 99% of Americans who don't serve, I don't think have a realistic understanding of the sacrifice that this imposes on veterans and their families, which I think is very real, as Mike outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. So building, Professor Giora, on this conversation about kind of social, economic, and impact on those who have served, are there social, cultural, and political considerations in Israel in your experience, or is this just kind of accepted as, well, that's life?
So probably about until 20 years ago, when you were looking for a job after the military, which is age 18 to 21, and then you would go to college and you look for a job, literally the first question you were asked is, where did you serve? It was literally the litmus test for quality of service. Did you truly contribute to society? And there's been a shift in Israeli society, I think, unfortunately, where that question is not asked. We are today, I think, from my perspective, unfortunately willing to tolerate not serving and looking for exceptions, which I think is problematic. But historically, to your question, Dean, socially, politically, culturally, it really was a dividing line between serving and not serving. And the whole notion of not serving is just, again, not part of the culture. Shift in society today, but I think for many of us, did you serve? Did you not serve? Where did you serve? Is like a line. And creating exceptions is problematic because create exception, there's always then the exception to the exception, which opens up all kinds of doors. But I do really think that it is, again, litmus test.
So Leah, building on that, having kind of heard how things are in Israel, in today's society here in the United States, how do you think the younger generations would react to compulsory service?
I personally think that they would post it on TikTok. Yeah. But seriously. I mean, I think we have a recent history of how injustice has been dealt with by our younger generation and even an older generation, examples being Black Lives Matter, even the issue of abortion, that topic. I think that, like the Vietnam War, there'd be a lot of protests and probably a more violent and a grander example of that for today.
Interesting. So then, Mike, so if that's the impact in society generally, what do you think would be the impact of mandatory service in the United States military?
Simple answer is we don't know, but I think you'd have to look at history and looking at kind of how the draft went in Vietnam. So looking at how traditionally in the U.S., the draft was set up as something where it was pretty much conflict related, so that it would swell the ranks during the time of conflict, and then it would reduce afterwards. And then after World War II, we transitioned to combat the threat of communism. And so that just, for a 25-year period of the extended draft, it just really kind of ate away and corroded at the military effectiveness of the armed forces. And you started seeing discipline and morale issues in Vietnam, such as rampant drug use throughout the force, and then fragging as well. And so I think if we were to impact or do something like this again, where we're not seeing an existential national war effort, you'd have a really problematic social response to social response to a draft, and then it would degrade the military effectiveness as well.
And then building on Mike's point about military effectiveness, Professor Holbrook, if we had had a conscripted military, what do you think would have happened in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? Would they have lasted so long?
Having served in Vietnam and during the Vietnam period, basically 1965 to 1973, there was a very organized, sincere anti-draft protest movement, which I think forced President Nixon to begin winding down the war in 1969. And I was in the first group of U.S. troops to be pulled out of Vietnam, so I only served there for 8 months. And in some ways, I think it is possible to believe that my life was spared because of the anti-draft movement, which forced that political pressure on our government leaders about a very unpopular war. And as you all know, the Afghanistan war lasted, 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. And the Iraq war, depending on when you believe it ended, lasted maybe 10 years. I think had there been national mandatory service with a draft, there would have been an anti-draft protest movement about both of those wars. And I think it would have put political pressure on our government to shorten the wars. And I think we wouldn't have been in either country for as long as we were.
Very interesting. So kind of given all of those thoughts, Professor Giora, and what the reaction might be and what the impact would have been, is there any discussion in Israel to moving to a voluntary army or to limiting the length of service?
So length of service is changed every few years depending on threats that are identified, threats that have been perhaps minimized. The discussion about doing away with the draft, the answer is no. It's just, again, part of our culture. And we don't have any, anti-draft movements. We don't, Holbrook served in Vietnam at the height of the anti-draft movement. The whole, if you think about it, America historically, the songs that took, the anti-war songs that were so much a part of the 1960s, we don't have that in Israel. The only time there's ever been any, not even demonstrations, but when we've had soldiers who've been kidnapped and there was a sense the government wasn't working hard enough to get their release, mothers would go to the, where soldiers are drafted, the induction center. So, thank you. Mothers would go to the induction center and talk to the other parents, making sure that they understood that the obligation of the state is to ensure that the child be returned. But other than that, that is probably the extent of the protest. It's just, again, an inherent part of the culture in Israel.
Fascinating cultural differences there. Leah, if you could go back again, would you choose to serve again? Or what might you have done differently?
Ultimately, yes, I would. Going back, I would probably pick a different career field. Building bombs, as fun as it was, I probably, if I had known, my passion for the legal career field, I probably would have picked a specialty that went down that path. I think that the military does have its benefits. It has humbled me in ways that I never thought I could be humbled. It's definitely forced me to overcome some of my weaknesses and turn them into strengths. And going along with that, it's also helped me realize how to use my strengths to help other people. So overall, yes, I think that I would enlist again, maybe commission. They've got a cushier job, but yeah, overall, yes, I would.
Great, thank you, Leah. So, Mike, I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of these cultural differences. So, dozens of countries have successful mandatory service programs. What makes the United States different that would kind of undermine a similar program here?
I think Professor Giora kind of hit a big one as far as Israel's kind of a good foil. They have existential threats to their national survival right all around. Ukraine also has a program in there similar, as is Korea, both sides of Korea. And then you also see some successful draft programs in authoritarian states like Iran and Russia. And then the other one would be social services. All of these societies have extensive social services, free healthcare or universal healthcare at least, and heavily subsidized universities that make higher education much more affordable. And these are things that are actively opposed by the U.S. Political system as a whole, as we saw with last night's elections. So I think that's kind of the biggest issues that we would run into. You'd essentially be serving, and what are you getting in return?
Great. Well, Professor Holbrook, our last pre-prepared question goes to you. Does the broader American public really understand what military experience is like for service members and their families?
I don't think so. I think all of our panelists, having served in the military during times of conflict, understand that it's a unique experience, and probably the only civilian occupation which is close to it would be that of a police officer who goes to work in the morning not knowing exactly what's going to happen during the day. And that's the reality of serving in combat, I think. And it's so difficult for civilians to understand that at a gut level. And once you've shared that military experience, I can talk to Mike, for example, about what he did in the sandbox. And the weapons are different, the tactics are different, but we share a common experience, separated by 50 years. And so this notion of a band of brothers or a band of brothers and sisters is very real, I think. And I honor all of your service.
Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to our questions. And so again, just a reminder to everybody, if you go to Slido, slido.com, and enter the code #universalservice, you're able to ask a question of our panelists. So our first question said, did the reference survey, so at the beginning of our panel, we mentioned what are the percentage differences in the United States as to support for mandatory national service. Did that survey, give additional information as to why respondents did or did not support mandatory service? Are any of you familiar with those reasons, or maybe you could speculate the reasons why folks do or do not support?
I think some of that goes down to looking at kind of what you're getting in return for service. If there's a lot of other problematic issues that we haven't really kind of touched on as far as that would come out of mandating service for everybody in the country, as far as just even like ballooning the DoD budget, stretching the VA even thinner than it already is. But when you're looking at the social services that are kind of returned to veterans, the GI Bill is great, but it also, like 6 out of 10 people on the GI Bill still have to take out student loans. The VA is famously problematic as far as like the free health care that we're supposed to get for your service. So it just, I feel, and this is not based on anything other than a gut feeling, but I feel like it kind of would feel, people would think that it was kind of a service for nothing, for not much in return at least.
So I think this question goes to Professor Giora. What are the consequences for those who might refuse to serve in Israel?
So we used to have our version of conscientious objectors, which were literally a handful. and they just made their way off into society. Were they looked upon historically negatively? Probably. I think today there's probably greater, I don't know if I would use the word understanding or greater tolerance, I don't know which comes first, but I don't think the same negativity is applied to that. So in that sense, the consequences are less significant than they had been in the past. But again, that fluctuates. Mike referenced the existential threat. So every time, maybe the best way to answer this is every time we have yet another operation, say in Gaza, and we have reservists are called up, for instance, it's literally 100% to show up. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. No questions asked. So there is that, again, with the word I used earlier, that collective, and in spite of all of our political differences, of which there are many, makes America look like child's play. When it need be, we rally around the flag, even though we're critical.
So the next question asks, should universal service require military service, or would you be in support of an alternative Peace Corps that completes humanitarian or environmental work?
I fully support alternative service. I don't think the military is appropriate for everybody. I think the opportunity to do something like working in a foreign country or working in a disadvantaged neighborhood or teaching in a school for at-risk kids or working in a hospital for 1 or 2 years would be a cohesive and important way for all of us to share being truly American. So I would support alternative service.
I would agree. I think that's a great point. But the problem that comes with that is if you have military service with all of the pitfalls that come along with it, and then you have this other pathway, is how are you distinguishing between who gets selected for which side of the service? If it's a purely voluntary and you can kind of go either way, I think you've got a better shot at it. But if it's going to be a selective process, then you have a lot of issues with the socioeconomic gaps that are going to continue to spread.
So kind of building on that then, this idea of maybe having two paths of service and what Professor Giora stated has been the Israeli experience. How do you believe conscientious objectors fit into universal military service?
I'll take the dive. So being a conscientious objector is fine, but from my perspective, it shouldn't free you from a sense of obligation, responsibility, and duty. And this model we've created in Israel of the national service, what I mentioned earlier, working with Holocaust survivors. I mean, many of you know that my parents were Holocaust survivors. They would come visit my parents. They would come visit, when parents are hospitalized. I think that stuff is invaluable. It's making a direct contribution. Or as Holbrook mentioned, working with, with underserviced or under needy communities. So you want to be a conscientious objector, you don't want to carry a gun, fine. But that shouldn't free you of obligation to society. And I think, I'm going to sound horribly old here, but the use or misuse of that status in no way should free you of obligation to the greater collective. And again, this is me. I've always been skeptical of the consequences of CO status. I think it can be misused. It can be used as a mechanism for granting yourself an exception to contributing to larger society. And I find that deeply troubling.
I think it almost points to a larger problem with this conversation of mandatory national service being assumed to be military, and possibly even a larger societal issue as a whole, that we assume that it has to be military. There's tons of ways that we could address societal issues with some sort of 1 or 2 year commitment after high school or college or whatever, that would help all sorts of, issues throughout the country and throughout the world.
I agree with what Professor Giora and Mike are talking about, but at the same time, if we're forcing people to serve, their heart's not going to be in it. And if your heart's not in it, you're not going to be effective. And I think forcing people to relinquish their individual autonomy in their decisions in their own life, I think that's going to have serious repercussions that are going to affect in the long run.
So we've talked a little bit about kind of socioeconomic impact. Do you find any issue with the economic incentive the U.S. creates in recruiting people to military service? So, for example, tuition reduction. It seems like service in the U.S. is less of an act of civic duty and more of one of economic necessity.
I'm not going to lie. I joined the military to get my college paid for, so there are some benefits to service, but I think I can't speak for every panelist here, but there is a draw of pride in your country and wanting to, show that gratitude of, being born in this country and respecting it and giving back in that way. So, I mean, I could see why people would not want to serve on a basis of wanting to provide for their country, etc. But I think the benefits, for the most part, are acceptable or appropriate.
So maybe Professor Giora can start with this answer, but others may have something to contribute. In places where there is compulsory service, like Israel, is there more support for veterans, and is there less negative effects, such as PTSD and substance abuse?
So we're really good at talking the talk on that one, and we're pretty bad at walking the walk. Up until 25 years ago, this is highly problematic, we did not really acknowledge that there was PTSD. And that is a shame on us. And we today acknowledge and provide assistance. Do we do it in a way as well as it could be done? No. And there's so much so that earlier this year, a soldier, it's a terrible story, he was wounded, severely wounded, felt that the Ministry of Defense was not providing him the kind of resources for his care. And as part of his protest, this really is a terrible story, he self-immolated. He he set himself on fire. He has recovered, but it really caught everybody's attention that the care must be from A to Z. It's not A to N, and it's not enough just to say, go team go, that there is an absolute requirement in the Ministry of Defense, various aspects of the Ministry of Defense, to provide veterans, whether it's physical injury or emotional harm, to provide them and their families assistance throughout. In the same way that we're really good about talking about Holocaust survivors. It's a stain on Israeli society, the extent to which we provide them assistance, and that there's an absolute connection between the two. It is a true stain in our society.
It's interesting that our country has a large standing army, and with a volunteer force, I think pay is better than it was during the draft period. But I still think Congress is very reluctant to pay the full cost of service. And for Vietnam, it was Agent Orange and all of the health consequences caused by Agent Orange. And in the sandboxes today, it's the burn pits and all of the health consequences from the burn pits. And so I think if we had more universal service, there would be more support for making sure that all of the consequences of military service were paid for by our government. And there are issues like PTSD, which are really lifelong issues, so that military service, especially in combat, is a life-changing experience for a lifetime. And we should be willing to accept that as a fact and compensate for that.
Add something. I think we all need to know something. When Holbrook's generation came back from Vietnam, they were not warmly received by the American public. That's an understatement. Those of you who don't know, people like Holbrook, when they came back, when they landed in San Francisco at the airport, many of them were spat on. It's absolutely a disgrace. And I would think that the PTSD that Professor Holbrook talks about very openly, there's actually a double PTSD. There's the PTSD of serving in a place like Vietnam or Iraq, Afghanistan. The secondary PTSD is when they came back and they were not embraced by the public. They were looked upon as having committed war crimes. I mean, we all know. And when Jim talks about PTSD, the truth of the matter is that generation suffered twice. Once because they were sent to a place they couldn't find on the map, and two, when they came back, they were seen as the arch villain. You want to talk about shame? That's an absolute shame on American society.
So,
Yeah, there's a law school related footnote to what Amos said. I think there were about 10 Vietnam veterans in my law school class, but we never, ever talked about it. It was completely a dirty little secret that nobody wanted to talk about because it was so socially punished.
how can mandatory military service be squared with moral or ethical objections? If exceptions are made for those reasons for non-military service, how can those be made equitable across race, class, gender, and other social identities?
I think the only way to truly address this issue is to remove the mandatory military from it. And if you're going to do some sort of mandatory service, it has to be a national service as compared to a military first service. And then you can if you take that presumption out, you have a lot less moral and ethical qualms with it. And you can actually have it be a positive thing rather than, subjecting our will over other people.
Okay. Would anyone recommend increasing the current age range of 25 required by U.S. selective service?
I read an article the other day because there is a decrease in volunteers for the military. The Coast Guard, I believe it was, has expanded or increased its applicant age range, I think up to 42. So I think we're steadily starting to loosen up the requirements for military service.
Do you think making mandatory service would improve our societies? So such things as outlooks, homelessness, morale, a sense of belonging?
I'll start on this one. I don't think so. As far as just the budgetary concerns from, we already have a ridiculous defense budget. If you're going to bring all these extra people in, you're going to have to find ways to fund that. And only 25% of the budget right now actually goes to soldiers. The rest of it's for R&D and other training exercises and stuff like that. So that number would get massive. Stretching the VA, which is already stretched thin, would not be able to. We'd see even bigger issues with the veteran population. And then if you also look at, there's a significant issue with right-wing extremist groups recruiting military veterans and people with military experience. So if you balloon that number, you're just giving them an even larger pool of people who will then be more disaffected by the fact that they don't have these services and they had a poor experience in the military that they didn't choose to go into.
I do think that universal service with alternative paths other than the military could be a unifying cultural kind of experience that Amos talked about. And if it were compensated, it could be an investment in young people. And if there could be something like the GI Bill for civilian service, where a high school graduate could spend 2 years doing something in the public good and then afford to go to college for 4 years, I think that kind of investment in our young people and in our society would be a unifying factor, which I think could be very valuable.
So shifting the conversation for a moment, rather than mandatory service, why can't we simply outsource all military efforts to private companies?
Race.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Young people first.
I think we can just look at the last 20 years of war, of the global war on terrorism. When I was in Afghanistan, I sat next to three people who pulled in more than $1 million a year, and Lockheed made a ton of money off of that, and they had a very vested interest in keeping us in that war. And so I think you kind of have the opposite issue of, as far as mandatory service, which has the tendency to hold politicians more accountable. You shift it over to corporate interests who they want to make the money. So now they have no interest in keeping in ending this and keeping it going as long as possible. Yeah.
3 words. What's it called? Blackwater. 2, the Uniform Court of Military Justice does not necessarily apply to private contractors. And 3, other than Holbrook, I'm the oldest person here, the great song from Woodstock Generation, 1, 2, 3, what are we all fighting for? Wall Street, don't be slow. There's plenty of good money to be made providing the Army with the tools of the trade. It becomes a financial thing, and that's just absolutely does America wrong every which way on Sunday.
Okay, so back to mandatory service. So under a mandatory service system, participants would be required to forego typical entry into the workplace for a period of time. What financial incentives would or could be deployed to compensate individuals for such compulsory service income?
So we've created a system now in Israel that if you serve in a combat unit, and when you go, we don't have college, you go to professional school, to serve in a combat unit, your education, professional education, is literally paid through 100%. If you served in a non-combat unit, for various reasons, you get less, but we really have made the decision as a society to financially, I don't know if the word is reward, compensate those who served in combat units, and I am fully on board with that.
I think with universal service, other than military service, I would think that people should be compensated with like a living stipend while they're serving, and then have a post-service benefit similar to the GI Bill that they could use to go to school.
How do you think mandatory national service would impact national sentiment about entering wars?
I think Vietnam's a great example of this, as far as it's not necessarily going to stop you from getting into it, but it can limit the time that you're there, and just holding politicians accountable.
Provided who's actually going to Vietnam. Because I remind all of us that there's a long line of very distinguished people who were of draft age, whose daddy knew who to call, and therefore they did not go to Vietnam. And we ended up, a phrase you all are familiar with, that in many ways Vietnam became, quote unquote, what was referred to as the black man's war, because African American daddies didn't know who to call, or didn't know how to call, or didn't have the right person to call. And there's absolutely a bifurcated system in terms of Vietnam, of who was serving. And I think in terms of American society, that really, those who were demonstrating, like in Ann Arbor, right? All those college kids who were demonstrating, who were writing op-eds in the Michigan Daily every day, they weren't going to Vietnam because their daddy knew who to call. That is highly problematic. So you could have a draft. The question is, do you have so many exceptions to the draft that you end up with a system that's utterly inequitable?
Related to that was the number of troops escalated dramatically during the Vietnam War. It started out in '65 with like 60,000 troops, but by 1968 there were nearly 500,000 troops, which meant that the number of bodies that had to go into the military was dramatically larger. And so that fell on a lot of other people, including college graduates. And that's, I think, when the anti-war movement got really fired up, is when that happened.
Because their friends were suddenly the ones who were being drafted.
So any thoughts on Pete Buttigieg's proposed reasons for national service, In 2020, he talked about how it can help young people interact with individuals from starkly different backgrounds and break down race and class barriers.
I can start on this one. I think that's a fair point as far as what one of the benefits of service, but I think it discounts a lot of the other downfalls and other cultural issues within the service. It's easy to say that, being forced to work with people of other backgrounds makes you more tolerant, but it really doesn't, as we've seen with a lot of people who come out and still believe these same things. They have a way of dissociating the individual from the group, and it doesn't necessarily solve the issues of racism or otherism.
From my experience going into the service and being around people of all different backgrounds, it definitely helped me open my eyes to see how other people live, what they've experienced, and I wouldn't say make me more tolerant, but more accepting of other ways of life. And I know that at least at my base, it definitely seemed to be the majority kind of outlook. So I definitely see the benefits of that in respect to tolerance of diversity.
My experience about that, two different stories. When I was in basic training, I was assigned to help a young black kid from Chicago who was functionally illiterate take and pass military exams, written exams. And I basically told him, mark A, mark C, mark D. And that was my role, because they wanted him to get through basic training so he could go to Vietnam. And then the other experience was in combat. There was very little racism in combat. Where it existed was in base camps, where there was racial segregation and racial hatred. But out in the field, we were all brothers and living under the same conditions and exposed to the same risks.
So if the current United States administrative state cannot support 1% of the population that currently serves, what changes do you predict need to be made to the administrative state if mandatory service were implemented?
I think we're talking about a cultural shift as a nation as a whole, away from this extreme kind of bootstraps mentality where everybody is taking care of only themselves, and actually into a more service-minded and communal society, to actually recognize that there's value in community programs and social services, and there could be an exchange for that with some sort of service.
I agree with Mike, but I also think not only did I serve, my wife served, our kids served, we have to be careful with what I call the glorification of the military. And the best example I can give, when I go to Michigan football games, there are sometimes flyovers. And the over-the-top cheering of the helicopter that's above us as if it has just saved the world, I find that problematic. And sometimes I find myself sitting next to veterans. And they're like me, like, why are people cheering as if some great event has happened? And I think we have to be really careful. Military service is hard. I mean, this is hard stuff. I don't think there's any glory in this. This is hard stuff. It's demanding. And Jim said it strains the hell out of you. And to celebrate the plane flying over you, I just find that to be, for me, utterly over the top. And I always look to see how people my age who have served, how they react. And they're like looking at the people who are just jumping up and down like, dude, really? If you feel that strongly, go serve.
So would a mandatory draft still consider the physical fitness and mental health of those drafted? Realistically, would very many people even qualify for a modern draft?
This is one of those points that gets brought up a lot. The military is really good at getting you in shape. Like, they'll find a way. If they need the people, they will find a way to get you where you need to be. I think that's kind of a cop-out.
There's also this thing that's used a lot called an exemption that is used a bunch in the military. So especially when it comes to physical fitness, I think they would find a way around it.
So there is significant social and political dispute in the United States today. Please speculate. Would mandatory service reduce or increase these tensions?
No, I don't, I'll take the lead. Sure. No, I don't think that they would impact America and American politics at the moment. I don't think that it's the great unifier. I don't know if it was Mike or Jim who referenced something that is disturbing is the rise of extreme right wing in the military, or the counter that the extreme right wing is recruiting people out of the military. That's highly problematic. But I don't think that, quote unquote, using the military as a way to rally around the flag and to make us all kumbaya, I don't think that's a realistic expectation.
So can you expand your discussion to include mandatory domestic national service, such as AmeriCorps, to improve our infrastructure? So how would national service outside of the military help infrastructure in the United States?
I think that's absolutely a plausible option if it's done correctly and takes into account socioeconomic issues as far as kind of who goes where. I think we've kind of touched on that several times. It's definitely something that is a good outlet for these, people coming out of high school or college and they don't really know what to do and they don't have skills, and that first job out is requiring 5 years of experience and you have 3 months at a Burger King. So I think that's a way that could absolutely be useful.
Going back to freedom of choice, I don't think if you force people, I mean, there are benefits to contributing to your society and your community, but if you force them to do it, it's not going to be genuine. And it could ultimately be the complete opposite of what you want to result. And I'm against forcing people to do something that their heart's not in.
So to everyone on the panel, as someone who has served in the military, particularly if you've seen combat, would you have any qualms about seeing your family members enter the military as part of the draft?
I don't have children, and in part that was an intentional decision coming back from Vietnam. I would probably do the same thing over again, but I would be extremely reluctant if I had a son or grandson to tell them to enlist and choose a combat arms and put themselves in harm's way, because it is a life-changing, lifelong experience that is, you cannot predict how it will affect an individual. It has significant benefits, I think, that we're all celebrating, but it has real costs involved as well.
Yeah, Leah keeps on coming back to the choice of it all. And I think there's, I made my choice at 18 to do it, but one, I don't think I was as well informed as I should have been. So anytime I do talk to somebody who's considering it, I try to talk about all those, the downfalls and the nastier side of service. And then you also have to look at how the military is being used over the last 20 years and, believably for the next 20 years, as the U.S. military is not necessarily what we had during World War II, where we were going to fight, the big bad, where the conflicts are much more amorphous and ethically dubious.
I'd like Amos to comment on, in Israel, I think there's a greater expectation that because you're going to put children in harm's way, you expect their leaders to be much more protective of them.
So we have three expressions in Hebrew. I mean, we have many expressions in Hebrew, but we have three expressions in Hebrew relevant to this conversation. And as you asked your question, I said to myself, I'm going to share them, and I try to stay within a tight swim lane. One, we don't own our children, we rent our children from the Army. Because we all know that when the child becomes 18 or 19, that they will go to the Army. That's one. Two, we have two grandchildren, we all say the same thing to our children and grandchildren. When you will be of age, there will no longer be a need for an army. We all say that, we all repeat that mantra. Three, we all dread the day that we take our children to the induction center, because there is this, let's see if I can make this. There is this moment where we took our kids there, my wife and I took our three children. There's this moment you're waiting, and then there's a board with their kid's name, and you're dreading it. I want to emphasize, you're dreading it because you are going to do this with your child, which absolutely ties into Jim's question. Not all commanders are fit to be commanders, and as a parent, there's nothing that keeps you up at night more than when your child is in the Army, other than your child being in the Army, is whether or not their commanders are fit to be commanders of your children. And that is 24-hour, 7-day a week concern, whether or not you have turned your child over to someone who is fit to assume responsibility for your child. And that is, having been a commander, I'm sure there were parents who were asking about me, that, when I think about my kids, that is the litmus test of deep and profound concern, because I'm giving you my child. I'm not giving you my neighbor's child, I'm giving you my child. On the other hand, that's part of life in Israel.
So this is a question from Mike and Leah. What did you learn in your service that has helped you the most in law school?
Dealing with immense pressure, not only to perform, because in the military failure is like not an option, and time management, having to accomplish a multitude of tasks within a very, very strict timeline. I think that has helped me a lot, and also being situationally aware, not only about my surroundings, but about opportunities that present themselves, and being able to help others where they struggle, because if you help someone that struggles, that ultimately helps you not only become a better person, but maybe shed light on how life could be. So I think caring for others, going back to the whole notion of brotherhood and sisterhood, I think that's definitely stuck with me. Yeah.
The first thing that came to mind was when I was a young lieutenant and I was walking into my boss's office, and I knew I was about to get destroyed because I'd messed something up. And I was like really kind of panicking about it. And then I was just like, you can't kill me. I'm going to go home at the end of the day. I'm going to eat dinner. I'm going to go to bed. I'll have a bed. It's fine. And that guy wrote me a very nice letter to get in here. So people think about you a lot less than you think they do. Things matter a lot less than you think they do. And then also just kind of a notion of like a rising tide raises all ships. So I try to always kind of keep an eye out for how I can help other people, because whether or not it's going to help me directly, it's going to make everybody better.
Yeah, my expression about that was whenever I faced something that was really unpleasant, my reaction was, what are you going to do, send me to Vietnam?
So what does the panel think about Russian men fleeing Russia to avoid the draft? Does a draft harm the legitimacy and support of a state more than it aids nationalism?
I mean, if I lived in Russia at the moment, I'd be buying a one-way ticket to anywhere, because I think that there's clearly a recognition amongst those who are privy to the news, obviously not everybody's privy to the news in Russia, that there's no justification, rationalization for this utterly crazy war, and I totally understand those who are running, fleeing, however the hell they're getting out of there. It makes utter total sense to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it highlights a potential issue if we were to institute something like that in the U.S., where with the state of the media and that we have now, where we're not necessarily, there's a lack of trust in it, and necessarily we have a similar issue in Russia where it's completely state controlled, whereas ours isn't state controlled, but it's just distorted. It's probably the nice way to put it. And so if you're not necessarily getting the actual truth of the matter, what are you going to do when you have no choice about going to fight that war?
In Russia right now, when Putin reinstituted the draft, there were 250,000 young men who left the country, the way Amos described. And also, those who have been drafted recently were sent immediately to the front lines. Many of them were killed. And so the number of funerals in Russia is increasing significantly. And mothers, that's the anti-war movement in Russia are mothers. And I think Putin is beginning to feel some of that pressure. There was a story, I think, yesterday that he met with an ally who was a leader of a Russian province on the Pacific Ocean, 6,000 miles away, who was expressing to him how costly that service was for the men in his province.
So isn't the freedom to not serve at the very core of our Constitution?
Absolutely. I feel like implementing something like compulsory service infringes upon the core values of our nation. And I can't get past that so many men and women have given their lives to protect those freedoms that it just doesn't make sense to force Americans to go against what our nation kind of was founded upon.
Okay, so this is a military history question for Mike. With the observation that current military service is not an experience that helps move one up the socioeconomic ladder, did the military of the 1950s, 1960s fare any better?
That's probably debatable. I would imagine after World War II, there's an argument that it may have. But I think I'd say it probably was a means of moving forward, coming back from World War II and maybe even Korea. And that's purely anecdotal, thinking about my grandparents. But I'd say after Vietnam, that shifted dramatically.
So with large issues of sexual abuse of women and transgender people in the military, how would a mandatory service program affect this issue?
So the first thing is to recognize secret that there are sexual assaults in the military. I'm joking. I mean, if you're going to have an obligatory service, absolutely the responsibility of the commander is to ensure that men and women and other groups are protected. And that has not been traditionally a strong suit in the American military. There's been historically a denial of sexual assault, sexual harassment in the military. That's not a good thing. We had that in Israel also. We 20 years ago came to the conclusion that there had been too many instances of sexual assaults, and because it is a compulsory military service, the Army really was forced to step into this and to acknowledge this and to take harsh measures against commanders. There have been commanders who I would say were generals. They are no longer generals because they had been convicted of sexual assaults and rape. And that is exactly the way it must be. Because again, if you're going to send your child and somebody's not going to protect, regardless of their gender, if they're not going to be protected and they will be vulnerable, then people need to be held accountable regardless of their rank.
As a purely practical matter, how can one organize universal compulsory service in the United States with almost 330 million people versus a dramatically lower scale of Israel and about 9 million?
That's an outstanding question.
I think it would take a much greater national commitment than we observe now, and it would result in a substantial expense that we're not willing to pay now. But I think the benefits of it are worth that kind of investment. And yeah.
We'd probably have to look somewhere like Korea, which still has a smaller population, but it's at least a little bit more comparable. But yeah, that'd be problematic.
So do you see any conflicts with a mandatory draft after high school and also religious service missions? So especially here in Utah, where within the LDS religion, serving a mission after high school is highly encouraged.
So West Point actually deals with that pretty significantly because a lot of the LDS population goes to the service academies, and they're really good about they get 2 years in at the academy, then they leave for their mission, and they come back and they're reintegrated right back in. So I think with the national service, it'd be pretty easy to kind of just either say you pick which one you're going to do first and you do it, and then you go to the other one. We're not looking at like a long commitment here. We're looking at a year or two, either way.
I think
Go ahead.
similarly to people who enlist in the military or commission, they make a commitment to go to school first, and then after that they have to do their service. So I think it'd be something similar to that.
And during Vietnam, it was relatively easy to get deferments, which is what Mike is talking about, so that you're postponing your obligation for either to go to school or to do something else. And then you're expected to do your military service at the end of your deferment.
So what are the potential downstream consequences of a universal service that includes women of childbearing age? What advantages would come of a draft or service that includes all genders? I think, Leo, this goes back to your point earlier.
I mean, there are women who serve in the military that are within childbearing ages, and a lot of them get deployed and are separated from their families. And I mean, it's just, I hate to say it, but it comes with the territory. That's why I think having the choice to subject yourself to these conditions of potentially, being separated from your family and maybe not even returning, I think that needs to be on the person individually to choose. I don't know if that fully answers your question, though.
So someone asked, couldn't you adjust for the physical and emotional differences between military service and other forms of non-military service by making compulsory military service much shorter than non-military compulsory service?
So one of the realities of compulsory or military service for combat soldiers, whether it's whether it's artillery, ground troops, Navy, Air Force, there's a pretty significant training period. I mean, unlike the Russian model where you're drafted, you're given a gun, and you're sent off to Ukraine, in a normal place, it takes time to train. X months or a couple of years. If you take this seriously, you have to train responsibly and seriously, which, by the way, also goes to Mike's point. It's expensive to train. I mean, it's really expensive to train. But you can't just bring somebody in, give them a gun, and send them off to the front because his or her chances of surviving are nil, frankly. And that's why training is long and it's hard, but it's an inherent and an integral part of the process.
I think that having mandatory, like a time frame maybe of like 2 years would be ineffective. you have someone that enters into the military, you train them up, and then by the time they're fully competent in what they're supposed to do, they're out of there. So I think ultimately it'd just be ineffective.
So we'll end today on a completely non-political question. So is universal service a pro-life or a pro-choice issue?
I'll put on my Israeli hat, and I will dodge the question. I think it's a pro-survival. Historically, not to glorify this, I'm not in the business of glorification, we just didn't have a choice. I mean, it is what it is. And maybe here in the United States, there is a luxury. There's a thing called the Atlantic Ocean, there's the Pacific Ocean. We ain't got that. And we just don't really have that plan B.
There's not a lot of autonomous choice when you serve in the military. And I do think that it is a question of survival of yourself and your buddies. And it's even less so than the mission. And that's what becomes important, is to get through this and get home.
Well, on that note, I want to thank our amazing panelists for their fantastic comments and contributions on this really interesting and thought-provoking question of should the United States institute mandatory national service. So a big thank you to them. And again, I want to acknowledge and honor everyone who served and acknowledge that Friday is Veterans Day. Thank you, everyone.